So today we are going to talk about circles. I have no idea who's been in math or if maybe not been to any math classes or not. So hopefully this will make sense just kind of as a standalone lesson. I know Sean last talked about area and perimeter, or at least I hope he did, and he wanted me to start with circles. So circles are pretty straightforward. People get scared off by them because we have to talk about pi and we have to know what pi is, but it's not as big and scary as it sounds. So circles, just like with any shape, when we're talking about circumference and area, we're talking about the same things as we are when we talk about perimeter and area. The difference is a circle has, no sides, or it has just one continuous side, right? And so to figure out, first of all, the area, but secondly, the circumference, which I'll explain what that is in just a second, we have to have different types of formulas than we do for, say, a square or a triangle or a rectangle, okay? So the circumference of a circle is just another word for perimeter. I don't know why they choose to use a different word. That's just the way circles go. So the circumference is this distance around the outside of the circle, right? If you were to measure it, if you had a circle and you had a tape measure and you just wrap the tape measure around the outside, that would be the circumference. Whereas the area, just like with the other shapes that Tom was talking about last week, the area is just the space inside the circle, or the two-dimensional space, in the inside of the circle, how much space it takes, okay? So today I just want to go through the two formulas, okay? Because we only need to know two formulas, one for circumference, one for area of a circle. Go over some examples and then look at just a couple practice questions. Keep it real short and simple, and hopefully things will make sense. And if they don't, then you can take it up with Sean when he comes back next week and tell him how awesome he is and that you missed him, and he loves that kind of stuff. Regardless, let's take a look at the two. So before we look at the formulas themselves, three key things we need to know, right? We need to understand what the radius of a circle is and what the diameter of a circle is, and then we have to know pi. If we know those three things, we can solve any of these formulas very easily, okay? So this little diagram over here shows us the difference between radius and diameter. And you might already know this. So some of this might be review, and if that's the case, then just kind of bear with me. Radius is the distance from the center point to the outside of the circle, right? Whereas the diameter is the distance all the way across the circle through the center point. So the easy way to remember it is the diameter is always going to be twice as long as the radius. Radius is always going to be half as long as the diameter, right? So if the radius is 2, the diameter of a circle is 4, right? If the diameter of a circle is 10, the radius is 5, okay? So that is easy. What gets difficult is with circles and the formulas for circles is just getting them mixed up, because that part of it is simple, okay? So as we get down here to pi, which is the last thing we really have to talk about before we talk about pi is really the last thing we have to talk about before we look at the equations. And pi is, simply put, radius, or not radius, pi is the ratio between the circumference of the diameter and the diameter. Man, did I say circumference of the diameter? Man, I must be rusty on my math. The circumference of the circle to the diameter of the circle. In other words, if you take a circle, no matter how big or how small, and you take the distance around and you divide it by the distance across, you will always end up with the same number, no matter what. right? And so somewhere someone figured that out, and that number is 3.14, blah, 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 blah. Pi continues indefinitely, so any kind of value that we use for pi is just an approximation. So if you use one of these calculators, and I have no idea if you have one of these with you, if you do, you can use the little pi button, right? And it will give you a much more accurate reading of pi. You can also just approximate 3.14, and that will get you pretty close, right? So that's often what you hear and what people remember, and that's okay. You can use that. If you're taking a practice test or the real test, make sure if you get a question that deals with circles or anything circular where you have to use pi, check to see what they want you to use in terms of pi. They might want you to use the symbol. They might say just use 3.14. So just follow what they tell you, and that way you'll get a more accurate answer. But for today's lesson, we're just going to use 3.14 and just kind of keep it, okay? So let's look at the formula. And I apologize for kind of talking too much. That is the, but let's look at the two formulas. So the formula for circumference, in other words, how we figure out the distance around, okay? If you know the diameter of the circle, then you can figure out the circumference by taking the diameter and multiplying it by pi. Okay? So in the little example here, and I'll just go through these two examples real quickly, and then I'll pull up the whiteboard and we'll actually do a couple. Okay, sound all right? So the example here says a china plate has a gold rim. The plate's diameter is 10.5 inches. What is the distance around the rim to the nearest tenth of an inch? Okay, so again, here's our formula. C equals pi times diameter. Pi is represented by the silly symbol there, if you are familiar with that. So all we have to do to figure out circumference is use 3.14 and do 3.14 times the diameter, which is 10.5 inches, and it gives us whatever that is. I can't read backwards, right? 32.97. And if we round that to the nearest tenth of an inch, it rounds up all the way to 33 inches. So this particular plate, if it was 10.5 inches across, would have a diameter of 33 inches. Make sense? All right, let's look at area real quick, and then I'll have you try one. So here is an example of area. The formula for area is only slightly different. So circumference is pi times diameter. Area is pi times radius squared. So a couple things. Remember, make sure we remember radius is half of the diameter. Likewise, diameter is double radius. Also, remember, when we square something, that means that number times itself, not times 2. Okay? So in this example, it says the circular surface of a satellite component must be covered with heat-resistant tiles. If the radius of the component is 4 meters, what is the area in square meters? And remember, circumference is distance around, area is the space inside, right? The total space that the circle takes up. And so here, again, we're going to use 3.14, and we're going to multiply that times the radius squared. 4 squared is 16. 16 times 3.14 comes out to 50.24 square meters. Okay? So hopefully that's somewhat straightforward. And the last thing I'll say on these formulas is, remember, you don't have to memorize any of these geometry formulas. Okay? They're all given to you before you take a practice test or a real test. Right? So those formulas are all on that sheet. What you do have to know is you have to know what to do with them. Because if you look at the formula of circumference of a circle, you don't know what the heck C or this symbol or D stand for, then the formula sheet's not going to help, right? So make sure you know what these things mean, but don't worry about having to memorize. All right, so let me pull up a new share, and let's give this a shot. kind of my first go at a white. So I'm going to just make a random circle. So let's draw. And for those of you that kind of came after my big spiel, I am not Sean, as you might be able to tell. Sean will be back on next Monday. He's just doing a class these next 3 days, so I'll take over his math class just temporarily. So here is a picture of a circle, right? Okay, fair enough. Let's pretend that's the center. Great, okay. And let's plop up this equals 7. So there's our circle. Close enough, right? This circle has a radius of 7 inches. Okay, so go ahead and see if you can find the circumference and find the area. Right? So again, I'll put the formulas up here. And I don't know how to do all the math symbols on the whiteboard. I looked around and couldn't quite find them, and I just figured, forget it. I'll just type them up. Pi times diameter. That's how you find circumference. And then area equals pi times radius squared. I'm just going to write it like that. Remember, this means r times itself. Okay? So I'll give you just a couple minutes, and then I'll kind of walk through them. I'll walk through them anyway, but just see if we can figure out the two things, right? So here's a circle with a radius of 7 inches, and we just want to know what the circumference is and the area. Our little middle point. Circumference. Again, we're going to approximate 3.14 for pi. And I didn't give you the diameter, and I understand that this is easy math, right? But these are little things that the GED will do to try to trick you. They'll give you a question that deals with circumference, but then they'll give you the radius, not the diameter. And they're just trying to make sure, do you know the formula? Do you know the difference between diameter and radius? And if you do, right, making sure that you don't kind of rush and just throw in 7, right? That would get you a wrong answer. Okay? So that's the key here, is you got to slow down, make sure that we know the formula for circumference is actually pi, 3.14, times diameter. So if the radius of this particular circle is 7, what is the diameter? 7 times 2. Okay, so that's basic math, but that's little things that if you miss on the test, you do everything else right, you're not going to get it right. So again, I just pointed out because that's the kind of stuff that GED will throw at you to try to trick you up or trip you up or trick you or throw you off. And we don't want that to happen, right? We need to get these questions right. So maybe you've already done it. Let's see, what 3.14 times 14 comes out to what? 4 times 14 comes out to 43.96. And I don't know how often Sean talks about it, and that would be inches. But one thing with math, and especially geometry, that I like to mention is make sure you know, and this sounds obvious, make sure you know how to round. Okay? The two things on the test that I really see, I don't see people asking you to round to the nearest hundredth or thousandth very often. Really, all I see is, can you round to the nearest whole number, and can you round to the nearest tenth? Those are the two things that you need to know. Okay? So in this case, this number rounded to the nearest whole number and rounded to the nearest tenth would be the same. So maybe this isn't a great example. but I'll come back to it. So either way, if this was rounded to the nearest whole number or rounded to the nearest tenth, we would end up with an answer of approximately 44. And I bring rounding up only because, again, on the test, lots and lots of questions will ask you to round, and if you screw up rounding and you've done everything else right, it would be a shame to get to the very end, round it wrong, and get the answer. That's it. That's my spiel on rounding. All right, so let's take the same circle. Let me make sure we're doing it on time. Okay, let's do the same circle and calculate the area, which remember, area is the space inside. Oh. I'm new to this whiteboard. I don't use it very often. Okay. So I was going to try to color the inside, but so area is, again, the space inside of our circle. And if we want to know the formula for area, okay, you need to do pi, 3.14, times our radius. Now, our radius is 7 inches. We need to do radius squared, which is times, okay? So, and bear with me, I know in algebra and geometry, we really shouldn't be using X as the symbol for multiplication, but I'm going to anyway. All right, so 7 times 7 is 49. Make sure we do that first, right? We do, if we remember our PEMDAS or order of operations, we always square things before we multiply them. So 7 squared is 49. There. And 3.14 times 49 is 153.86 square inches, right? Because remember, with area, and I don't know how much of this Sean explained, but with area, we're always measuring square units, as opposed to perimeter or circumference is just one dimension, right? You're just measuring distance. Area is you're measuring basically how many square units fit inside that square, or that circle. Now, oh, I deleted it. But again, rounding here, so 153.86, okay, if we were rounding that to the nearest whole number, then we would look at the 8. And if it's 5 or greater, which it is, it rounds this up. So this would round up to 154. If we were rounding to the nearest tenth of an inch, right, that would mean we're rounding to this place here. So we look one place behind it. This is also a 5 or greater. It's a 6. That would round it up to 153.9. Okay, so again, that's all I'll say on rounding. All right, so hopefully those kind of make sense. I want to spend the last few minutes of class doing a practice question. So looking at what might pop up on the test. So let me clear this, and I'm gonna see if this works. I don't know. Stop me if it doesn't. And I think I just want to do this question because it's the most difficult one. So I don't know. All right. So hopefully you can see my question here. So number 7 is what we're working on. Okay. And I will attempt to replicate this question over here. I was trying to draw concentric circles earlier, and it was pretty difficult. I didn't think that would work. So all right, hold on one second. This is what we're going to do. Bear with me. I'll come back to the whiteboard in just a minute. Let's do this. I know there's a way to split. I'll work on it. So number 7 is what we're going to do. Okay, so maybe we'll just talk through it, and I can pull up the whiteboard if we want. So this is a pretty tricky question, and one that most people, when we go through this, don't get this right. So that's kind of why I chose it. So the question says, on the target below, 5 and 10 point bands are each 2 inches wide. The inner circle has a diameter of 2 inches. What that is telling us, let's just break that down. So on this target down here, the 5 and 10 point bands, so in other words, these 2 outer bands are each 2 inches wide. 2 inches wide. That means from here to here is 2 inches, and from here to here is 2. Okay. Then it says that the inner circle, in other words, this small, the 25 point circle, has a diameter of 2 inches, which means all the way across this is 2 inches. Now it's misleading because this looks bigger, but just go with it because that's what they tell us, right? So this is 2 inches, this is 2 inches, and then all the way across this is 2 inches. Now that we have that under control, let's look at what the question asks us. The question says, to the nearest inch, what is the outer circumference of the 10 point band? 6, 13, 19, or 113 inches. Okay, so we need to know what the outer circumference of the 10 point band. All right, so think about that for a minute. I'm going to go back to my whiteboard and draw this up. So again, drawing these concentric circles is a little harder than I thought. I'm going to try it. So pretend those are all equidistant, okay? Even though I can tell that they're not, right? But okay, that. Well, maybe not a good choice. Okay, so even though I can obviously see that those are not the same dimensions, let's pretend they are, okay? That's what the book tells us. It was saying that, okay, these 2 bands are 2 inches, and the diameter there is 2 inches. So, okay, 2 and, okay, so there we go. And we want to know what the outer circumference of the 10 point band is. And so remember, and I won't type in the numbers here, but this was the 5 point band. The middle one was the 10 point. And the innermost one was the 25 point band, right? So if we want to know what the outer circumference of the 10 point band is, what we are really trying to find I don't think I can do that. That's too hard. I was trying to perfectly overlay it. But you can get the idea. That middle circle is what we're looking for. We're trying to find the circumference of just that middle circle. Normally, I wouldn't walk us through this quite as much, but I feel like I'm talking to myself at some points, so I'm just going to do it anyway. So, all right, remember, the formula of circumference, pi times diameter. We know what pi is, right? So we know pi is 3.14 4. But we don't know what the diameter is. And remember, if we're just concerned with this inner or this middle circle, right? How do we find the diameter? Remember, the diameter is the distance all the way across. So we don't care about this outer circle at all. We don't care about the inner circle, right? We just care about this middle circle. So what we really need to find I'll use a brand new color. What we need to find is this distance. What is the distance all the way across this middle circle? And we can use this information to tell us. So if this is 2, it's 2 from here to here. It's also 2 from here to here. But one thing that most people forget is, remember, we have to figure out this other side, which is also 2. So the diameter all the way across this thing would be 2. 6. And once we know that, we can do 3.14 times 6. And that gives us 18.84. Rounded to the nearest inch, it tells us, comes out to 19 inches. So again, pretty complicated problem, and maybe one that is kind of difficult to do over Zoom like this, but hopefully that kind of makes sense. But that's the level of question that you might expect to see on the test. So we'll stop there. I don't know. Oh yeah, perfect. We'll stop there for the day. Tomorrow and Thursday, we will spend those days going over volume, and we'll look at the volume of a bunch of different shapes. So that's it for circles. If you do kind of need more help on it, or you want more clarification on it, always ask Sean or myself, and we can go over more of it. Hopefully that somewhat made sense and was helpful. But anyways, I will see everyone back for math tomorrow and Thursday. And if you are really a glutton for punishment and you want to sit in on my social studies and science classes, then you can really get sick of me by the end. All right, that's all I've got. So again, hopefully that was helpful, and I will talk to everyone later.